sort of, oh, sorry. The meeting will be recorded. We will have a Q&A afterward that will not be recorded. So don't worry about that. Yes, this is the sort of first Zoom presentation of the Animal Liberation Working Group of the Democratic Socialists of America. We were formed in 2017, I think shortly before that year's convention. A few of us got together, and generally at that time, even pre-pandemic, we were using Zoom just because we were all over the country. And we're worked on a couple projects over the next couple years. There was at the 2019 convention, we passed out, we had some zines and stickers and pins, I think, that we handed out. And then over the last few months, we've been working to really kind of draw together what the connections between socialism and animal liberation, how the one entails the other, and really kind of turn this into something that can be a force both in DSA and the broader left, and hopefully, the world. So as I mentioned, there will be a Q&A afterward. I'll be turning the chat off during the actual presentation, just so we're not all distracted. But you can message me, Dayton Martindale, directly if you have any questions, and we can circle back and ask them at the end. And then also, obviously, we'll turn off the recording and turn on the chat for the Q&A section. So yeah, we'll have more information at the end, but if you want to join us, our next meeting is going to be Tuesday, November 23rd. You can find info on our Twitter or our email list, and we'll be sending it out. And so the last thing is, as soon as the presentation starts, I'm going to send a sign-in Google form. If everyone could fill that out. Actually, I'll send it right now. So that, yeah, just so we know who came and who's interested, and we can get you all on our email list. So yeah, without further ado, our two presenters today, who are both members of the working group and put a lot of work into this presentation. Helena Carlson is a member of the Central Connecticut DSA chapter and also of the IWW Freelance Journalists Union. And then we have Philip Murphy, who affiliates with the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. He's a founding member of the Buddhist Action Coalition, NYC, founder of Ahimsa Dharma, Anti-Speciesist Action, and a co-founder of the New York City chapter of Animal Rebellion, which is a climate justice and animal justice organization. So yeah, take it away, Philip. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, Dayton. And thank you all, welcome all to this inaugural presentation of the DSA Animal Liberation Working Group. We're really happy to have you all here. I'm coming to you from the New York, Philadelphia corridor. I orient primarily to New York City, but actually I'm active in both cities. And it's great to be with you. And again, thank you all for being here. I want to extend a special thanks to all of the participants today who are new or relatively newly acquainted with concepts such as anthropocentrism, human supremacy, speciesism, and animal liberation as anti-speciesism. For those of us who were born into a speciesist society, and that would include all of us, the examination of these concepts can be challenging, and we want everyone to know that this is a welcoming space, and we want to, we're looking to build community here. And again, glad that everyone's here today. We can advance the slide next, please. So this quote is from the DSA website. We are socialists because we reject an international economic order sustained by private profit, alienated labor, race and gender discrimination, environmental destruction, and brutality and violence in defense of the status quo. So we reject an exploitative international economic order, and because we recognize all sentient beings as members of the exploited class. We stand against exploitation based on any and all morally inconsequential traits, and that includes species membership. Next slide, please. What is animal liberation? Animal liberation is a movement committed to recognizing that all sentient beings are members of the moral community, to abolishing the systemic breeding, using, commodification, and killing of non-human animals, and enacting a socialist society in which class, hierarchy, and domination are replaced with mutual flourishing that extends to all individuals, human and non. So all sentient beings, by virtue of their being sentient, i.e. demonstrating a unified psychological presence and intentional behavior whereby a being seeks to achieve flourishing while avoiding suffering, these beings are members of the moral community. It is morally indefensible for a sentient being to be the property of another being and exploited for their use value as property. Consequently, animal liberation is an integral component part of a collective liberation project that realizes the conditions for flourishing for all sentient beings. Next slide, please. Why animal liberation? We align with the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness of 2012, whereby prominent neurosciences affirm that all animals are animals, certainly vertebrates, so mammals and birds are sentient and conscious beings. These qualities give our lives meaning, that the qualities that give our lives meaning are qualities we inherently share with other members of other species, and in adherence with the conventional idea of moral value, defined by the very, that the moral value is defined by the very hegemonic forces that as socialists we oppose. So to comment briefly, the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness of 2012 affirmed that all mammals and birds, along with other animals such as octopi, possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. And moreover, these beings demonstrate intentional behavior that indicates that they are sentient. In the words of philosopher Tom Regan, other animals demonstrate a unified psychological presence. They are aware of what happens to them, and what happens to them matters to them. The experiences that make our lives meaningful, bodily autonomy, forming familial bonds, creating extended communities, and more generally seeking to flourish while avoiding suffering, are experiences that our fellow animals demonstrate through their behavior and are meaningful to them as well. In capitalist societies, value is framed as use value rather than intrinsic value. Animals are exploited as commodities for the use value of their flesh, secretions, muscle power, and the capacity to provide entertainment value. A coherent, expansive socialist project will necessarily exclude the use of other animals as tools, models, or commodities. Next slide, please. I mentioned Tom Regan previously. This is a beautiful quote from the late Professor Regan. All animals are somebody, someone with a life of their own. Behind those eyes is a story, the story of their life in their world as they experience it. In our culture, we have been encouraged to think of animals as things, as commodities. The great challenge lies in having a change of perception. Because we have been born into an exploitative society that renders other animals as tools, models, or commodities, our work is to see through our speciesist acculturation and to take contrary action towards the goal of collective liberation. Next slide, please. So this slide is from references a website, as it says in the header, it's a count of the animals slaughtered for food in real time. So we think this was very important to show because the numbers that are involved with regard to the commodification and killing of animals are simply mind-boggling. And to see these numbers tick up in real time really begins to give an indication of just the virtually incomprehensible numbers of animals that are exploited for various purposes. While most of us in society, of course, we know that animals are slaughtered for food and other uses, but we don't conceive of the scope and scale. I'm just going to let this run for just a minute. Okay, next slide. This slide represents a graphic representation of animal use, obviously strongly on the rise. Global meat production has more than quadrupled since 1961. 80 billion land animals and an estimated 1.5 trillion sea animals are killed each year just for food. That's worldwide. In the US, an estimated 12 to 24 million animals are held captive in laboratories and used in experiments in the US each year. 600 plus million animals are used for clothing in the US annually. And given that we're coming up on the Thanksgiving holiday, we'll mention that over 46 million turkeys killed in the US to be consumed on a single day as a way of giving thanks. This graph represents the explosive growth globally of land animals exploited for their flesh or, quote, meat, unquote. An aspect of the growth in meat consumption is driven by the export of the model of Western capitalist agricultural production and conceptions of affluence across the world. An additional element that should be noticed in this is the intense lobbying of the US federal government on the part of capitalist animal agriculture. Again, nearly incomprehensible numbers: 80 billion land animals, 1.5 trillion sea animals. With regard to animal testing, it bears mentioning that the roots of the animal justice movement are in the anti-vivisection movement going back to the mid-19th century. With regard to animal testing, it also bears mentioning that the efficacy of this testing is in fact very low, really inconsequential, and that there are now also technological innovations that allow for testing to be done without invasive experiments done on animals. Next slide, please. So I want to share a content warning. There'll be some images that could be considered disturbing in the next slide. Next, please. So the means by which animals are confined and commodified for their use value is actually shocking. In the US, 99% of all farmed animals are raised on factory farms. These animals are genetically modified to meet demand for increased amounts of flesh. This leads to birds who can't support their own weight, among other, terrible circumstances that generate tremendous suffering. Hyper confinement is an element of the efficiency, the quote efficiency unquote of these, barbaric factory farms. In order to, given these conditions of hyper confinement, practices that are standard have become standard, such as tail docking, castration, removing of teeth and debeaking, are done due to the disruption and the profound disruption of social life and the profound distress visited upon these sentient beings under these conditions, They will attack and cannibalize each other, literally going insane. So these measures are taken to avoid the destruction of their bodies. Intrinsic in these processes, particularly in the process of producing animal secretions known as milk and dairy, the separation of mother and child to the extreme distress of both. And in these practices, the male offspring are from an industrial standpoint, they're waste. So the male chicks and male calves are slaughtered shortly after birth. In the case of male chicks, on the day they are born. Vivisection, not surprisingly, involves intense suffering as animals are experimented upon while they're living. It bears mentioning also that wild animals suffer from human-caused violence in the form of extermination, habitat destruction, mass extinction, etc. So as we transition, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Helena. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, and hi, everybody. So why is a socialist analysis critical to the success or even to make progress towards animal liberation? There are many animal advocacy groups that exist, but as a group functioning under the DSA, we hope to position ourselves as not only animal liberationists, but also as socialists who recognize the need for the animal movement to develop a greater sense of class consciousness and class solidarity. Next slide, please. And so when it comes to facing something as vast and perverse, yet normalized as the institutions of animal use are, we must challenge it at a structural level. Hence, we understand that speciesism is not only a cultural or ideological phenomenon, but also a political and economic system that gives rise to these collectively held ideas. And like with fossil fuels, we understand that merely altering consumer habits is not enough to fix climate change. And in that same way, asking people to change their diets alone as a political strategy is simply insufficient. And this isn't to dismiss the importance of holding people accountable for the decisions they make at an individual level. I do believe that we should embody our values in our day-to-day choices, even as consumers. But we must also push for the animal rights movement to go beyond its consumerist focus towards fighting for system change. On the other hand, traditional liberal activism seeks market changes and solutions from within the system. And we don't believe that a solution is possible with our current system because it's predicated on infinite growth and commodifies everything in its path. And even though capitalism isn't the only source of animal suffering, and it's true that speciesist domination of animals precedes the existence of capitalism, what is undeniable is the extent to which capitalism has expanded exponentially the suffering and the use of animals by abusing these pre-existing hierarchical relations humans have had with other animals and profiting off of this relationship. So we're not saying that socialism is the only solution to animal liberation, but in that the antidote to capitalism is a socialist revolution, and in that capitalism is inextricably linked to the commodification of animals, their liberation is not achievable so long as capitalism continues to devastate all life on Earth. So we must work with movements who oppose the very same systems that harm humans and other animals. And opposing capitalism as a starting point provides the much needed structural analysis that's largely missing from the animal rights movement today. Next slide, please. And just to expand a bit more on how we believe that changing consumer habits alone as political praxis is insufficient, The animal advocacy movement often understates the power and influence of economic forces that drive the mass production of animal products, while overstating the power and influence that as consumers we have. Many scholars throughout history, including Engels himself, have postured that animals, as the first form of private property, were central to primitive accumulation. And in the modern day, the use of animals remains quite central to the capitalist economy. So here we have some examples of this. In the US, the production of animals accounts for approximately 40% of the GDP within the US agricultural sector, and the agricultural sector making about 5.2% of the US GDP. And so with that said, because the production of animals and extraction of their labor accounts for a fairly large portion of the existing economy, these industries wield an enormous amount of power. And the state, being an entity that exists to serve capitalist economic relations, can and do artificially manufacture an increase in demand of animal products to help inflate profit. So this happens even if there may be a growing number of consumers who choose to only buy plant-based products. And as we can see in this diagram provided by the Agricultural Fairness Alliance here, in 2020, of the $52 billion in farm subsidies and bailouts spent by the USDA, 60% of that went to meat, dairy, and animal feed production firms, and another 22% was marked as uncategorized, some of which went to insurance and market facilitation programs. However, I don't believe it would be an outrageous assumption to think that much, if not most, of these programs also exist to facilitate the meat economy. And another thing here to point out is that economic interests play not only a role in manufacturing demand for their own products, but also in determining aspects of our society more so than we think. From the choices as consumers were given at stores or at restaurants, to campaigning and advertising, or say consider the FDA nutritional recommendations on food eating, which contains nearly a third of its portions as animal products. This being another example in which the state enforces this demand. These industries create the social material context of our relationship, with non-human animals. And so it's not merely about acknowledging the powerful economic interests behind animal exploitation, but also how they fundamentally shape our culture and our society, even our language and ways of life. Next slide, please. And here we have a quote from David Nybert, who is a sociologist, a researcher and professor, author of the book Animal Oppression, and Human Violence, Domestication, Capitalism, and Global Conflict. He articulates this point very well that we're trying to make, which is here by saying, oppressive practices have deep roots in economic and political arrangements. Therefore, for injustices to be addressed effectively, it is not enough to try to change socially acquired prejudice or to focus only on moral change. The structure of the oppressive system itself must be challenged and changed. Next slide, please. So now that we know why anti-capitalism as a theoretical framework is critical to further the project of animal liberation, we then also want to answer the question of why it must be seen as part of the socialist vision of society. Next slide, please. Just as all other political movements are, animal exploitation is not a standalone issue. It doesn't exist within a vacuum. And in the same way that capitalism privileges private property over human life, it's unquestionable that it does the same thing for non-human life as well. The mass confinement, torture, slaughter of non-human animals, wild and domesticated, as well as persecution of animal activists by the state, is intimately tied with animal agriculture's rampant labor abuse of often immigrant workers, alongside the industry's contributions to air and water pollution, habitat loss, and ecosystem destruction. So the left and animal advocates must work in tandem, in solidarity with non-human animals, as well as with slaughterhouse workers, other frontline communities harmed by the animal agriculture industry. And in addition to working to end animal agriculture, we must find solutions for a just transition for workers in the industry, alternative and better forms of employment, and to build an ecologically sound plant-based food system that is cheap and accessible. And historically speaking, segments of the left have advocated to extend the fight for justice to non-humans, recognizing the intimate connections between their suffering with white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, and parallel systems of injustice proliferating under capitalism. Such activism include the Philadelphia Black Liberation Group, MOVE, which incorporated animal rights advocacy into its revolutionary theories, or the anarchist collective, the Animal Liberation Front, which has cells across the globe doing direct action work. And one of the most prominent revolutionaries herself, Angela Davis, in response to a question about being vegan, said, "It is part of a revolutionary perspective. How can we not only discover more compassionate relations with human beings, but how can we develop compassionate relations with the other creatures with whom we share this planet?" And that would mean challenging the whole capitalist industrial form of food production. After all, I do believe people become socialists because they are deeply sympathetic to the suffering that goes on in the world. And our sense of solidarity and love is what drives our passion to change the state of society. So, we do believe that a radically egalitarian world is not only possible, but that we have an obligation to bring it to life. And it would be inconsistent with our values to not also extend this vision of a better world to include one that is better for non-human animals as well, as they suffer at the hands of capitalism and at the hands of the rich and powerful in much the same ways that we do. Next slide, please. And before we move on, just a content warning that the images in the following slide may be upsetting to some viewers. So while these images are disturbing, they're comparatively more subdued than how it truly is. When it comes to the reality of how animals live in our human-dominated world, this reality is much more gruesome than can be captured in a series of images, however disturbing they may be. And as John Sanbonmatsu, a philosopher and professor, and editor of critical theory and animal liberation, poignantly said in an interview, even if it were it possible to create a socially egalitarian, socialist, or communalist society alongside slaughterhouses and laboratories teeming with captive mice and capuchin monkeys, at the end of the day, we would still be left having to face ourselves, to ask ourselves, what kind of being are we? What kind of being, that is, would intentionally construct a society on the basis of degradation and total violence and call itself free? In what possible sense could we deceive ourselves into thinking such a society is liberated? Next slide, please. So, as we've noted before, animal exploitation is no standalone issue. It belongs to a broader system of injustice. And as activists, we must seek to understand it within that context. Next slide, please. And of the many related issues, one of them is the rampant violations of workers that go on in the industry. Slaughterhouse workers toil in hazardous, violent environments and being forced to commit mass slaughter of other sentient, suffering beings takes a serious physical, emotional, and psychological toll that go on to permanently affect their lives and those surrounding them. Slaughterhouses have astronomical turnover rates, sometimes exceeding 100% annually. And research shows that 1 out of every slaughterhouse worker is plagued with work-related injuries, although this number is likely a very low estimate, since most incidents go unreported due to companies not wanting to pay more than the bare minimum in insurance. Workers are often exposed to poisonous chemicals used to kill animals, whose bodies are overcome with diseases and parasites and chemicals that are used to make their flesh look more fresh and appetizing. An incident in a chicken freezing plant in Alabama in 2010 left 130 workers requiring treatment and 7 in the ICU after being exposed to an ammonia leak. And such are far from being isolated incidents. Additionally, abattoirs often hire undocumented workers who are at even greater risk of abuse and less likely to report violations to the authorities, with the fear of deportation looming over them. And the same companies that hire immigrants, but will also hire child immigrants, many of whom are minors expected to work up to 90 hours a week, handling power saws, sharp knives, and toxic chemicals. And for women workers, many of whom are also immigrants, they are even more vulnerable as these violent environments create a culture that exposes them to physical and sexual abuse, almost all of which will also go unreported. And with that all said, not only is the farming of sentient beings inherently wrong, it would simply not be possible to have the production of meat be at the scale as it is today and be as cheap and accessible as it is in the Western world without the continued exploitation of workers. And no society under which fair treatment of workers can exist alongside factory farming and widespread accessibility of animal products as it is today. And here we have a quote from the former slaughterhouse worker at a morale plant in Iowa who recounts his experience. "The worst thing, worse than the physical danger, is the emotional toll. Pigs down on the kill floor have come up and nuzzled me like a puppy. 2 minutes later, I had to kill them, beat them to death with a pipe. I can't care." Next page, please. Rampant labor abuse alone is unacceptable. It is well documented also that animal agriculture has an enormous impact to ecosystem integrity. It is responsible for massive deforestation, ocean acidification, land and water use. 30% of the world's consumable fresh water goes to the production of meat, mostly to wealthy nations where meat consumption is higher. And this does not include the water use for dairy and egg industries. And approximately 50 football fields of land are bulldozed worldwide at every given minute, much of it being indigenous lands enforced with high biodiversity to create more room for production of farmed animals. And on the other hand, with the meat and dairy industries abolished, global farmland could be reduced by more than 75%, equivalent to the US, China, European Union, and Australia combined. And that reduced land would still be enough to produce plant-based crops to feed the existing world population. And the environmental impact of animal agriculture, just as environmental impact in general, disproportionately affects low-income communities and communities of color, who often are those living in the areas surrounding factory farms. And as a result, the very air they breathe, the water that they drink, the soil that they could otherwise garden and use is toxic and decreases quality and duration of their lives by significantly. And as Christopher Sebastian, who is a lecturer at Columbia University, and his research being largely focused on animal issues in relation to issues of race and class, said at the University of Gothenburg, industrial animal agriculture is a hate crime. It is first the performance of violence against animals, but the ecological damage wrought is also an act of genocide against those most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And it bears mentioning that these environmental impacts overdetermine the ethical case. And we really want to highlight that animals are individuals who exist independently from how they benefit our society. And using them is categorically wrong, even if animal farming did not have secondary environmental effects. Next slide, please. Now that we've discussed the merit of this work, the question then is, how would we achieve animal liberation? Next slide, please. And there's a history of political tactics that have been used, things like campaigning, attempts at legislative reform, anti-speciesist education, direct action work such as demonstrations, protests, rescues, disruptions. But on the left, there has not been a clear theory of praxis presented for how we should achieve this. That is something that we need to continue to work on. And for those interested in contributing to our working group, it's something we believe to be one of our priorities, which is to try to define this work in developing this praxis. And I'll hand it back to Dayton to discuss the next slides and what we hope our next steps are for the working group.
All right. Thank you so much, both Helena and Philip. Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation, and I hope others did as well. Yeah, so this is not just about giving a presentation, though. It's also about moving forward a political project and our organization. So the next steps that we've been thinking about here are sort of more broadly. Our organizational goals include building awareness within the DSA with stuff like this, which includes growing our presence internally and sort of getting other socialists to think more about these issues, partnering with other DSA efforts on intersecting issues, could be really into worker exploitation or ecology or anything else. Bringing at the general level, we want the DSA to recognize that animal liberation is a legitimate fight for justice, and also get the animal rights or animal liberation organizations that we're part of to realize that socialist analysis and DSA style organizing is necessary for our work and emphasize the anti-capitalist nature. More concretely, what that means, we're planning to launch a strategy-oriented reading group focused on critical assessment and discussion of different organizing strategies that have been used by the animal rights movement as well as the broader left, and how this might apply to our own organizing efforts as a group, and assess what works, what we're doing, what doesn't work, what we're doing, and what lessons we might learn from others to inform that. We also want formal recognition from the DSA. Currently, we are a working group informally, but we are not listed on as an official one, and so that would either be through I think approved from the NPC or through the next convention in 2023. We also relevant to that, have talked about developing a platform to be adapted at that 2023 DSA convention, where we actually have certain planks and goals and values related to animal liberation that are adopted more broadly by the organization. So how can you help? You're wondering. As I said at the very beginning, our working group meetings are every other Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. The next one is Tuesday, November 23rd. I'm in the second, I will send the sign up form in the chat. Attend our future events. And also I should say that we're a relatively young group. And so, even if you think this concrete work is not one of them you're more excited about than the other, we're flexible on what people want to do, or if people have new ideas that want to pursue them, we're absolutely open to that. And relatedly, with meeting times, we can be flexible if we have a lot of new members who can't make Tuesday night. We have your email if you've signed in, and we can share future events and future projects with you, whether or not you're part of the working group. And I will send, like I said, the sign up form for the organization in the chat in 1 second. And there it is. Great, next slide. Yes, so we are recording this presentation. Again, we'll stop recording before the Q&A, so you don't feel pressure from that, and copies of the slides will be uploaded to our website. What's our website, you ask? I will send it in the chat in a sec. But yeah, so if you have questions about the content, you can reach out to us. If you want to look back at something, you may have noticed that we had some links. But if there are more sources you're looking for, you want to learn more about something, please do. We also have a resources page on our website that has further reading by around animal issues and socialism. Next slide. Yeah, so you can, here's all our social media contact info. I will be, I or someone will be putting that into the chat after I'm done talking because it was too hard to do both at once. But thank you so much everyone for coming, and we're going to move to the Q&A section.